Over 40 years of working with people on their finances, I have noticed something that took me an embarrassingly long time to name clearly. The conversations that produce real change in someone's financial life are almost never the comfortable ones. They are the ones where something that had not been said directly, something that both people in the conversation knew was there, finally gets spoken out loud. Not harshly, not as criticism, just plainly, with the kind of directness that the situation actually requires. And the reason those honest conversations are rare is not that the people having them lack intelligence or goodwill. It is that the financial industry, by its structure and its incentives, is better organized around conversations that maintain relationships than conversations that tell hard truths. My name is Richard Harlow, and what I want to do today is say several things plainly. Things that, in my experience, most people over 50 genuinely need to hear and rarely do. The first honest thing is that the financial industry is not primarily organized around your retirement outcome. It is organized around its own revenue. Banks earn from the spread between deposit rates and lending rates. Investment product companies earn from management fees that are often higher than they need to be. Insurance companies earn from premiums that are rarely compared to market alternatives by clients who have maintained long relationships with the same institution. This is not a conspiracy. It is the ordinary logic of commercial enterprise. But understanding it changes everything about how you evaluate financial products and financial advice received through institutional channels. The person who understands that their bank is a business, whose incentives are not perfectly aligned with their own, reads every product recommendation differently than the person who experiences the relationship as advisory, in the way a doctor or a lawyer is advisory. And that different quality of reading, applied consistently over a decade, produces meaningfully different financial outcomes. Not because you become adversarial toward your bank, but because you become comparative. Because you start asking what the same function would cost at a different institution, what the same investment exposure would cost through a lower fee vehicle, what the same insurance coverage would cost from a carrier who has to compete for your premium, rather than benefit from your inertia. The second honest thing is more personal, and for most people, more uncomfortable to hear. The spending pattern you are currently maintaining was not deliberately designed. It accumulated, expense by expense, over decades in which each individual decision seemed reasonable, and none of them were ever examined as a complete system. The monthly subscription that seemed modest when it was started is still running years later without anyone having recently asked whether it is producing proportionate value. The insurance policy that was priced appropriately when it was purchased has never been compared to current market alternatives. The restaurant habits, the grocery delivery, the car arrangement, the utilities, none of these have been subjected to the question of whether they would be chosen today, explicitly, with full awareness of their cost and the alternatives available. The result of this accumulated, unexamined spending is a monthly expenditure structure that, for most people over 50, contains a significant proportion of spending that persists by momentum rather than by genuine ongoing choice. This is not a character failure. It is the natural result of a life in which decisions accumulate faster than they are reviewed. But the financial consequence is real, and the money recoverable from a systematic, honest audit of recurring expenditure, from identifying and eliminating what does not survive the question of whether it would be chosen today, is typically the most immediately available capital in anyone's financial life after 50. Not dramatic in any individual item, but cumulatively meaningful and available right now, without waiting for income to increase or circumstances to change. The third honest thing cuts in two directions that I want to name separately. The first direction is that you have less time than you are probably comfortable acknowledging. The window of peak earnings and reduced competing demands. The window in which the combination of income, clarity of preferences, and freed capacity from earlier life obligations creates the highest capital efficiency of your financial life, is a specific period, not an open-ended one. Every year spent intending to address the financial priorities that need addressing, without actually addressing them, is a year that does not return. I've had this conversation with people at 52 and people at 61, and the difference in outcome between the person who makes the changes at 52 and the person who makes the same changes at 61 is not trivial. The second direction is that the time that remains is more valuable than the standard discouraged narrative about age and finance suggests. You are not behind in the way that framing implies. You are exactly where you are, with exactly the resources you have. And those resources, examined honestly and deployed deliberately, rather than allowed to sit in their current inertia, are capable of producing meaningfully different outcomes over the decade ahead than the outcomes that will result from continuing without examination. Let me make this concrete through a man named Reginald, 62 years old, retired postal supervisor, with a government pension covering his basic expenses and a modest investment account he had been contributing to for years. Reginald came to see me not because anything was visibly wrong, but because of a persistent awareness that his financial position was not what his income history should have produced. When we examined it honestly, what emerged was not a story of irresponsibility. It was a story of accumulated inertia, a spending structure full of expenses that had never been individually questioned, a banking relationship priced for his loyalty rather than his interests, and an investment account oriented entirely toward growing a future balance rather than generating any present income. These were not dramatic problems. In combination, over the years, they had operated without examination. They represented a meaningful gap between the financial position that Reginald's income should have produced and the one that existed. What changed over the following 18 months was not dramatic in any individual component. Every recurring expense was reviewed and explicitly decided about. Banking products were compared to alternatives, several for the first time in a decade. A portion of the investment account was reoriented toward dividend-paying equities that would generate quarterly income rather than only accumulate in value. The cumulative effect of these changes over 5 years was a financial position that Reginald described at our final meeting as genuinely different from anything he would have predicted when we first sat down together. Not because anything spectacular had happened, because a series of decisions made from an honest, rather than comfortable picture of his situation had produced a structure that served him meaningfully better than the accumulated default. The honest truth, said as plainly as I know how to say it, is that the starting point is always now. Not the ideal starting point, now. Not the comfortable one, now. The financial decisions that produce real outcomes in people's lives are the ones made in actual present conditions, with the resources that actually exist, by the person they actually are. Whatever the honest examination of your situation reveals, whatever the gap between current position and what your income history should have produced, whatever the expenses that have persisted without review, whatever the banking products priced for your inertia rather than your interest, the response to that honest picture is always the same. You begin with what you have, from where you are, and you make the changes that seeing clearly makes visible. That is the only thing that produces something different from what already exists.